A mercenary who deeply hated the Lakotas ended up saving exactly the son of the man he was supposed to kill. Ethan carried years of hatred against this tribe, built from stories of terror and losses on the American frontier. He was hired to eliminate a respected Lakota chief, but during a chaotic night of gunfire, he found his target's wounded son. Against all his logic and hatred, something inside him changed. Why would a man who hated the Lakotas so much risk everything to save the very heir of the one he was supposed to assassinate? The answer will shock you. Before we continue with the video, I ask that you subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It's quick, just to help us. Then go to the comments of this video and comment where you are watching this video from. Now let's go to the video after the intro.
Indigenous West Stories.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of South Dakota as Ethan Morrison adjusted his worn leather hat and checked his rifle for the third time. The year was 1907, and the American frontier was still a place where violence and survival walked hand in hand. At 35 years old, Ethan had made a living from what others couldn't or wouldn't do. He was a mercenary, a gun for hire, and today he had accepted what would become the most important contract of his life. The man who hired him was Samuel Whitmore, a wealthy land investor with cold eyes and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rough frontier town. Whitmore had spread a map across the saloon table, pointing to a specific area with his manicured finger. "His name is Chief Running Bear," Whitmore had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "He's been leading resistance against our expansion efforts. The local authorities can't touch him because he's too smart, too respected. But you can make him disappear." Ethan had listened without emotion as Whitmore explained the details. Chief Running Bear was the leader of a small but influential band of Lakotas who had been interfering with railroad construction and settlement expansion. They had been attacking supply convoys, freeing captured tribe members, and worst of all, convincing other tribes to join their resistance. The payment was substantial, enough to set Ethan up for years, but money wasn't the only reason Ethan accepted. Deep in his chest burned a hatred for the Lakotas that had been growing since childhood. His family had been among the early settlers, and he had grown up hearing stories of brutal raids, scalping, and the constant fear that came with living on the edge of Lakota territory. When he was 12, his uncle's family had been killed in what the newspapers called a savage attack. The images painted by survivors and witnesses had carved themselves into young Ethan's mind like scars that never healed. To Ethan, the Lakotas weren't people fighting for their land. They were obstacles to progress, dangerous animals that needed to be eliminated. This contract wasn't just business, it was personal justice delayed too long. For 3 days, Ethan tracked the tribe across the harsh terrain. He followed broken branches, horse tracks, and the subtle signs that only an experienced tracker could read. The Lakotas were careful, but Ethan was patient. He had learned to hunt men the same way others hunted deer, with methodical precision and endless persistence. On the third night, as he made camp in a small grove of cottonwood trees, Ethan heard the distant sound of gunfire. It wasn't the controlled shooting of a hunt or target practice. This was chaotic, violent, the kind of shooting that meant people were dying. He extinguished his small fire and moved toward the sound, his rifle ready. What he found made his blood run cold, but not for the reasons he expected. A group of about 20 armed settlers had surrounded a small Lakota camp. These weren't soldiers or lawmen. They were vigilantes, drunk on whiskey and hatred, shooting at anything that moved. Ethan watched from behind a large boulder as they set fire to tipis while families were still inside. He saw children running in terror while men with torches chased them like it was some kind of sick game. This wasn't warfare, this was slaughter. In the chaos, Ethan spotted a young Lakota man, maybe 17 or 18 years old, trying to help an elderly woman escape the flames. The young man was wounded, blood streaming from his left shoulder, but he kept moving, kept trying to save others even as bullets whistled around him. There was something about his face, his bearing, that reminded Ethan of the descriptions he'd heard of Chief Running Bear. This had to be the chief's son. The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow. Here was the heir to the man he'd been hired to kill, wounded and vulnerable, separated from his people in the chaos. All Ethan had to do was nothing. Let the vigilantes finish their work, and his contract would essentially complete itself. No chief, no heir, no more resistance. But as he watched the young man stumble and fall, still trying to crawl toward the elderly woman who was now motionless on the ground, something inside Ethan broke. Maybe it was the way the boy refused to abandon her even when it was clearly too late. Maybe it was the senseless brutality he was witnessing from men who claimed to represent civilization. Or maybe it was simply that in that moment, watching a son try desperately to save his people, Ethan saw something he had forgotten how to recognize: honor. Without thinking, Ethan found himself moving. He slipped through the shadows, using the chaos as cover, until he reached the wounded young man. The boy looked up at him with eyes full of pain and defiance, clearly expecting death. "Can you ride?" Ethan whispered in English, knowing most Lakotas understood at least some of the language. The young man's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he nodded, slightly. "Then we're leaving." Now, Ethan helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they moved away from the burning camp. His own horse was hidden in the trees about a quarter-mile away, but getting there while carrying a wounded person would be nearly impossible if they were spotted. They moved slowly, painfully, stopping every few yards to listen for pursuit. The young Lakota said nothing, but Ethan could feel the tension in his body, the way he flinched every time a branch snapped or the wind shifted. This was a person who had learned that every sound could mean death. When they finally reached Ethan's horse, the young man spoke for the first time. "Why?" His English was accented but clear. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know." And that was the truth. Everything Ethan thought he knew about himself, about right and wrong, about who deserved to live and die, had crumbled in the space of an hour. He helped the young man onto the horse and climbed up. Behind him, turning away from the orange glow that marked the destruction of everything this boy had called home, they rode through the night, stopping only when the horse needed rest. As dawn approached, Ethan found a small cave hidden among some rocks where they could rest safely. The young man's wound needed attention, and they both needed food and water. As Ethan cleaned and bandaged the bullet wound, the young man watched him with careful eyes. "You are the one they sent to kill my father." It wasn't a question. Ethan's hand stilled for a moment, then continued working on the bandage. "How do you know?" "I have seen you before. 3 days ago, watching our camp from the ridge. My father said a hunter was following us, but not for food." The young man winced as Ethan tightened the bandage. "He said this hunter was different, dangerous. Your father is a smart man. My father is a dead man if you complete your contract." Ethan finished with the bandage and sat back. "What's your name?" "Joseph. Joseph Running Bear." The young man's voice carried pride despite his circumstances. "And you are Ethan Morrison, the man who kills for money." The fact that Joseph knew his name shouldn't have surprised Ethan, but it did. It reminded him that he wasn't dealing with ignorant savages, as he'd been taught to think. These were people with intelligence networks, people who paid attention to threats. "Why did you save me?" Joseph asked again. Ethan was quiet for a long time, staring out at the vast landscape beyond the cave entrance. "Those men last night, they weren't soldiers. They weren't even fighting a war. They were just killing for the pleasure of it. And you are different." The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan had killed many men, but always for a reason. Money, self-defense, contracts that made sense in the harsh logic of the frontier. What he'd witnessed the night before was something else entirely. "I thought I was," Ethan said. Finally, over the next 2 days, as they traveled toward Lakota territory, Ethan began to see the world through different eyes. Joseph, despite his youth, spoke with the wisdom of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. He told stories of his people, not the savage tales Ethan had heard all his life, but stories of families, traditions, and a deep connection to the land that went back generations. "My grandfather used to say that the earth remembers everything," Joseph said as they shared a small fire on their second night together. "Every step, every breath, every drop of blood. He said that someday, when all the fighting is over, the earth will tell the true story of what happened here." Ethan found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in years. He learned that Chief Running Bear wasn't the bloodthirsty savage described in the newspapers, but a man trying to protect his people's way of life against impossible odds. He learned that the attacks on supply convoys were actually attempts to rescue Lakota children who had been kidnapped and forced into government schools. He learned that the resistance wasn't about hatred for white people, but about love for a homeland that was being stolen piece by piece. On the third day, they were spotted by a patrol of cavalry soldiers. Ethan and Joseph had to abandon the horse and continue on foot, hiding during the day and traveling at night. The pursuit was relentless, and Ethan realized that his decision to save Joseph had made him a wanted man. He was now considered a traitor by the very people who had once paid him. During one particularly difficult night, as they huddled together for warmth in a shallow depression in the prairie, Joseph asked the question that had been hanging between them. "When we reach my father, what will you do?" Ethan had been asking himself the same question. The contract was still valid. The money was still waiting. All he had to do was complete the job and disappear. But every hour spent with Joseph had made that possibility seem more distant. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "My father will not trust you. Even though you saved me, he will see you as the enemy who came to kill him." He'd be right. Joseph was quiet for a moment. "But you are not that man anymore, are you?" The question pierced through Ethan's defenses like an arrow. Was he still the same man who had accepted Whitmore's contract? Was he still the person who saw Lakotas as less than human? The honest answer frightened him. On the fourth day, they finally reached the edge of Lakota territory. Joseph's wound had healed enough for him to travel more easily, and his knowledge of the land allowed them to avoid the patrols that were still searching for them. As they approached the hidden camp where Chief Running Bear and the survivors had taken refuge, Joseph turned to Ethan one final time. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that you gave me the chance to see my father again. That means something even if nothing else does." The camp was hidden in a canyon, protected by natural walls, and accessible only through a narrow passage that could be easily defended. As they approached, Ethan could see sentries positioned on the high ground, their rifles trained on the entrance. Word of their arrival spread quickly, and by the time they reached the camp itself, a crowd had gathered. At the center of the crowd stood Chief Running Bear. Ethan had expected to see a savage, a primitive warrior driven by bloodlust and hatred. Instead, he found himself looking at a man of perhaps 50 years, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that spoke of natural authority. The chief's face showed the lines of someone who had carried great responsibility for many years, and his eyes held the kind of sadness that comes from watching your world disappear. When Chief Running Bear saw his son, relief flooded his features, but his gaze quickly shifted to Ethan with unmistakable recognition. "Father," Joseph said in Lakota, then switched to English so Ethan could understand. "This man saved my life. He is the one who was sent to kill you, but he chose to save me instead." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Ethan could feel the eyes of every person in the camp on him, could sense hands moving toward weapons. He kept his own hands visible and still, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger violence. Chief Running Bear studied Ethan for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his English was precise and formal. "You are Ethan Morrison, the mercenary." "Yes." "And you were paid to kill me." "Yes. But instead, you saved my son." Ethan looked at Joseph, then back at the chief. "Yes." "Why?" It was the same question Joseph had asked, the same question Ethan had been asking himself. But now, standing in front of the man he had been hired to kill, surrounded by the people he had been taught to hate, Ethan finally had an answer. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything." Chief Running Bear nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied him in some way. "My son tells me you have been hunted by your own people for saving him." "That's right. And what do you want from us now?" Ethan reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out the contract Whitmore had given him. He held it up so everyone could see, then tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the ground. "Nothing," he said. "I want nothing from you. I just wanted to bring your son home." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the canyon. Then Chief Running Bear stepped forward and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You have given me back my son," he said quietly. "But more than that, you have shown me that not all white men are the same. That is a gift I did not expect to receive. The moment was interrupted by the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. One of the sentries was signaling that armed men were approaching the camp. Within minutes, the peaceful scene had transformed into preparation for battle. "How many?" Chief Running Bear called to the sentry. "Many," came the reply. "Soldiers and civilians. They have surrounded the canyon." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Somehow their pursuers had tracked them to this hidden sanctuary. The very act of bringing Joseph home had led danger directly to his people. "This is my fault," Ethan said. "They followed us here." Chief Running Bear was already moving, issuing orders in Lakota as his people prepared for what looked like their final battle. Women and children were being moved to the most protected part of the canyon, while the warriors took defensive positions. "There's another way out," Joseph said urgently to his father. "The old trail behind the waterfall. If we move now, we can get the families out before they close the circle. And leave our home to be destroyed?" Chief Running Bear shook his head. "No, we have run far enough." Ethan looked around at the faces of the people preparing to fight. These weren't the savage warriors of frontier legend. These were families, fathers and mothers and children, making ready to die for the only home they had left. "Let me go out there," Ethan said suddenly. "Let me talk to them." "They will kill you," Chief Running Bear replied. "Maybe, but they might listen to me. I'm one of them, or I was. If I can buy you time to get your people out, and if you cannot?" Ethan checked his rifle and pistol, making sure both were loaded. "Then I'll fight with you." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise everyone else. A week ago, Ethan Morrison would have been leading the charge against this camp. Now he was offering to die defending it. Chief Running Bear studied him for a long moment. "You would fight your own people for us? They're not my people anymore," Ethan realized as he said it. "Maybe they never were." The chief nodded slowly. "Go then. Try to talk to them. But if words fail, come back quickly. We will need every rifle." Ethan made his way through the narrow passage that led out of the canyon, his hands raised to show he was approaching peacefully. As he emerged onto the open ground beyond, he could see the forces arrayed against the hidden camp. There were at least 40 men, a mixture of cavalry soldiers and armed civilians. At their head, he recognized Samuel Whitmore himself, along with a cavalry captain and several men who looked like professional gunfighters. "Morrison," Whitmore called out as Ethan approached, "I was beginning to think you'd gone native on us." "Mr. Whitmore," Ethan replied, stopping about 20 yards away, "seems like you brought quite an army to collect one man." "One man who failed to complete his contract," Whitmore said coldly. "One man who chose to betray his own kind for a bunch of savages." "Those people in there aren't savages," Ethan said. "They're families, children, old people. They're not your enemy." Whitmore laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Listen to yourself, Morrison. A week ago, you would have burned them out yourself for half the money I'm paying you." "A week ago, I was a different man." "No," Whitmore said, his voice hardening. "A week ago, you were a white man. Now you're a traitor. Captain Williams, arrest this man." The cavalry captain stepped forward, but Ethan raised his hand. "Wait, there are women and children in that camp. Let them go. Take me if you want, but let the families leave peacefully." "The only thing leaving that canyon will be smoke," Whitmore declared. "We're going to finish what should have been done years ago." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about progress," Whitmore snapped. "About making this land safe for civilization. Those people in there are the last obstacle to development of this entire region. When they're gone, the railroad can be completed, towns can be built, and decent people can live here without fear." "Decent people," Ethan repeated. "Like the ones who burned that camp 3 nights ago? The ones who shot children for sport?" Whitmore's face flushed red. "Those men were patriots defending their homes." "Those men were murderers," Ethan said flatly. "And so are you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan could see the cavalry captain looking uncomfortable, some of the soldiers shifting nervously. Not all of them were comfortable with what they were being asked to do. "Captain Williams," Ethan called out, "you swore an oath to protect American citizens. There are American citizens in that canyon, children born on American soil." "They're not citizens," Whitmore interjected. "They're hostiles, enemies of the state." "They're people," Ethan said simply. And if you attack that camp, you'll be committing murder. All of you." For a moment, it seemed like his words might have an effect. Several of the soldiers were looking at each other uncertainly, and the captain appeared to be reconsidering his orders. Then Whitmore drew his pistol and pointed it at Ethan. "Enough. You've made your choice, Morrison. You chose them over us, over your own kind. That makes you an enemy too." Ethan looked at the gun pointed at his chest, then at the faces of the men surrounding him. Some showed uncertainty. Others showed the kind of hatred he recognized because he had once carried it himself. But a few showed something else: shame. "You're right," Ethan said quietly. "I did make a choice. I chose to stop being the kind of man who kills children. I chose to stop being the kind of man who destroys families for money. If that makes me your enemy, then I'm proud to be your enemy." Whitmore's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, gunshots erupted from multiple directions. The Lakota warriors had positioned themselves on the high ground surrounding the canyon entrance, and they had opened fire on the attacking force. In the chaos that followed, Ethan dove for cover behind a large rock and drew his own weapons. The battle that ensued was unlike anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't a professional military engagement or even a typical frontier skirmish. This was a desperate fight for survival, with no quarter asked or given. Ethan found himself fighting alongside the very people he had once considered enemies, defending families he had never met against men who claimed to represent civilization. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was no time to contemplate it. The fighting was too intense, too immediate. Joseph appeared beside him, rifle in hand, despite his wounded shoulder. "My father says the families are moving to the back trail," he shouted over the gunfire. "But they need more time." "How much time?" 20 minutes, maybe 30. Ethan looked at the attacking force. They were well armed and determined, and they had the advantage of numbers. Holding them off for 30 minutes would require a miracle. "Tell your father I'll try to give him that time," Ethan said. For the next half hour, Ethan fought with a desperation he had never known before. He wasn't fighting for money or contracts or even survival. He was fighting for something he had never thought he would care about: the right of families to exist, to live their lives without being hunted like animals. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Men fell on both sides, their blood soaking into the hearth that Joseph's grandfather said remembered everything. Ethan found himself moving from position to position, trying to plug gaps in the defense, trying to buy precious minutes for the families escaping through the hidden trail. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls red with its dying light, the gunfire finally began to diminish. The attacking force had taken heavy casualties, and their enthusiasm for the fight was waning. Whitmore himself had been wounded, though not seriously, and Captain Williams was beginning to question the wisdom of continuing the assault. In the growing darkness, Chief Running Bear appeared at Ethan's side. "The families are safe," he said quietly. "They have reached the sacred caves. They cannot be followed there." Ethan nodded, suddenly feeling the exhaustion that came with the end of adrenaline. "Good. That's good. You fought well today," the chief said. "You fought like a man defending his own family." "Maybe I was," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the words. As night fell completely, the attacking force withdrew to regroup. They would be back in the morning, probably with reinforcements, but for now there was a respite. The surviving defenders gathered in the canyon to tend their wounds and prepare for what might be their final battle. Ethan sat apart from the others, cleaning his rifle and trying to process what had happened to him. A week ago, he had been a simple mercenary with a simple worldview. Now, he was a man without a country, fighting for people he had been raised to hate, defending a way of life he was only beginning to understand. Joseph approached and sat down beside him. "My father wants to speak with you." Chief Running Bear was waiting by a small fire, his face grave in the flickering light. "Ethan Morrison," he said formally, "you have fought bravely today. You have spilled blood to protect my people. But tomorrow, more soldiers will come, many more. This canyon will become our grave unless we leave tonight." "Then leave," Ethan said. "Take your people and go. Find somewhere safe." "There is nowhere safe," the chief replied sadly. "Not anymore. The world is changing too fast, and there is no place in it for us." "That's not true, isn't it?" Chief Running Bear gestured toward the canyon entrance, where the bodies of fallen warriors lay in the darkness. How many more of my people must die before you understand? We are the past, fighting against the future, and the future always wins. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, but that doesn't mean you have to surrender. It doesn't mean you have to let them destroy everything you are. And what would you have us do? Fight until the last man is dead? Until there are no Lakotas left to remember our stories? No, Ethan said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. I think you should disappear. Chief Running Bear frowned. I don't understand. The government wants to put your people on reservations, right? Control them, change them, make them into something they're not. But what if there were no people to put on reservations? What if the Lakotas simply vanished? You're talking about surrender. I'm talking about survival, Ethan said urgently. There are places in Canada, remote areas where a small group could live quietly, away from all this. Places where children could grow up learning the old ways, where the language and traditions could be preserved. Joseph leaned forward. You're talking about exile. I'm talking about life, Ethan replied. Your father is right. The world is changing, but that doesn't mean your people have to disappear from it completely. It just means they have to be smarter about how they survive. Chief Running Bear considered this for a long time. And you, what would become of you in this plan? Ethan had been thinking about that too. I can't go back to my old life. After today, I'm a wanted man among my own people. But I know the country between here and Canada. I know how to move without being seen, how to avoid patrols and settlements. You would guide us, if you'll have me? The chief looked at his son, then back at Ethan. Why would you do this? You owe us nothing. You have already risked everything to save Joseph and fight beside us today. Ethan stared into the fire, trying to find the words for something he barely understood himself. A week ago, I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew right from wrong, good from evil. But everything I believed was built on lies, on fear and hatred and ignorance. He looked up at Chief Running Bear. You people aren't my enemies. You never were. You're just trying to protect your families, your way of life, your home. That's not evil, that's human. And the money, the contract? What of your reputation as a mercenary? Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the torn pieces of Whitmore's contract. He threw them into the fire and watched them burn. Some things are more important than money. The next morning, as the first light of dawn touched the canyon walls, the attacking force returned. But when they entered the hidden camp, they found it empty. The Lakotas had vanished in the night, leaving behind only cold ashes and the echo of ancient songs carried on the wind. Whitmore was furious, but there was nothing to be done. Without a trail to follow, without any sign of which direction the tribe had gone, pursuit was impossible. The mercenary Morrison had disappeared as well, along with any hope of completing the original contract. Miles to the north, a small group of travelers made their way carefully through the wilderness. They moved at night when possible, avoided settlements and main roads, and left no trace of their passage. Leading them was a white man who had once been their enemy, now committed to their survival. The journey to Canada took 3 months. It was hard, dangerous travel, marked by close calls with military patrols, harsh weather, and the constant challenge of keeping a group of 30 people fed and hidden. But Ethan had learned patience from his years as a tracker, and Chief Running Bear had learned wisdom from his years as a leader. When they finally crossed the border into Canada, it felt like stepping into a different world. Here, the Lakotas were not hunted fugitives, but simply another group of Indigenous people seeking a place to live in peace. The Canadian government, while not perfect, was less aggressive in its policies toward native peoples. They found a remote valley in the northern wilderness, far from any settlements, where they could establish a new home. It wasn't the vast plains of their ancestors, but it was safe. It was a place where children could learn the old stories, where the language could be preserved, where the traditions could continue. Ethan helped them build their new settlement, using skills he had learned in his years on the frontier. But more than that, he helped them navigate the complex relationship with the outside world. His knowledge of white society, his understanding of how governments and businesses operated, proved invaluable in protecting their hidden community. Years passed. The children grew up speaking both Lakota and English, learning both the old ways and the new skills they would need to survive in a changing world. Joseph became a leader among his people, carrying forward his father's wisdom while adapting to new realities. And Ethan found something he had never expected to find: a home. Not just a place to live, but a community where he belonged, where his skills and knowledge were valued, where he was judged not by his past, but by his choices. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Chief Running Bear, now an old man but still sharp and wise, the chief asked him a question that had been years in the making. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your old life for this one?" Ethan looked around at the peaceful settlement, at the children playing games their grandparents had played, at the young people learning skills that would help them survive in both worlds. "No," he said quietly. "I regret that it took me so long to find it." Chief Running Bear nodded. "My grandfather used to say that every man has two lives. The first ends when he realizes he has been living someone else's story. And the second begins when he starts writing his own." Ethan Morrison had been hired to end a bloodline, to eliminate a people's future. Instead, he had helped ensure their survival. He had been paid to be an instrument of destruction, but had chosen to become a guardian of life. The mercenary who had hated the Lakotas had indeed saved the son of the man he was supposed to kill. But in doing so, he had saved something far more important. He had saved himself. In the end, the earth remembered everything, just as Joseph's grandfather had said. It remembered the violence and the hatred, the fear and the anger. But it also remembered the moment when one man chose to stop being what others expected him to be and started being who he was meant to be. And in that choice, both the hunter and the hunted found their way home.